This is Jack Stanley, and I wanted to talk more about the Edison recording studios because the Edison recording studios are quite fascinating, and there's an amazing amount of history that has been somewhat lost, and perhaps most of it will never be known because, when it comes to techniques, they're usually kept secret. And usually when something is kept secret, it's rarely written down. And that's the unfortunate point with a lot of the recordings done with many companies. They had their special sacred cows, and that was more or less an oral tradition, one might say. And with the Edison recording laboratories, which were located in New York City mainly, so was the case. But we do know many, many aspects of it. First off, it was a dead studio, and there's a reason for that, because the advertisement for Edison records, and it was called the phonograph of the soul because it has the living sound, the living presence of the artist. That's what they advertised. And so with that, there was the studio would be surrounded in fabric to absorb echoes and things like that. And also the floors were designed to absorb sound, as were the ceilings. So everywhere you looked, it was basically designed to absorb sound. Except for, of course, the recording horn, which everything would be focused into. And so the recording would be made of a perfectly dead performance. Sounds very different. Play an Edison Diamond Disc record, and then play a Victor record. The difference could not be greater, because it's a totally different type of sound. Listen to various singers, and you'll hear that ringing quality on the Victor record. That was an inherent quality of Victor records. You don't hear that on Edison. What you hear is the actual voice of the singer. And when you set up the machine and played it, the record that was playing on that machine would take on the acoustics of the room, rather than the room in which the record was made would force the acoustics into the room in which it was playing. Very different. And that's all well and good. And of course, when we get to the Columbia Street Studios and the 125-foot horn, which I have made a video on already, but I remember Theodore Edison telling me that he would walk into the Columbia Street Studio in the recording building where the 125-foot horn was connected. And he'd walk in. It was all cow hair. The whole inside of the building was all cow hair. And he said he would walk in and go, and you wouldn't get any kind of echo back. Nothing. It was dead. And that's exactly what Edison wanted. A dead sound. And of course, that would work very, very well. But I have to tell you something here that I find a little interesting about the Edison acoustic system. And that is, it was a remarkable system. And for pre-World War I recording, there's nothing like it. It's truly remarkable. But the process of making the records was extremely complex. And that's where a lot of the problems arose, because they were a composite record. Condensite on the outside. Inside was several different things, Indian rubber. They tried sawdust, China clay, all different types of things they experimented with. They ended up with China clay for a number of them, and also they used a composite of wood pulp as well. That also worked. But once again, with wood pulp, you got a big problem. If it gets wet, it expands. So that was a big problem. So the recording studios were great. The records left something to be desired. The problem is that Edison came up with his disc record in 1912. This is far after every other company got into the fray, and there were patents that stood in the way of Edison. Now, Edison could have bought a deciding interest in the Columbia Phonograph Company, but he refused to do so, even though his lawyers came to him and said, "This is great, do it." He wouldn't do it. He could have been involved in a disc market and more into the cylinder market in a single stroke. But that he didn't do. Imagine if he had, what would have happened to Columbia? What would have happened to the name Edison record? Would it become the Edison Columbia or the Columbia Edison? Who knows? It'd be a very interesting thing. It would have been a fascinating period in recorded sound. But let's just remember the Edison recording studio, remarkable, fantastic, well ahead of its contemporaries. But as the records themselves, they did leave much to be desired. When they worked, they were fantastic, but there were so many things to go wrong with them. Needless to say, of course, they were big, they were bulky. The system to play it was big and bulky, and if the needle went bad, your records went bad real fast, because it was a diamond needle. Another thing, lastly, to mention. In 1925, most of the companies, major companies, went electric. Edison did not. Edison was against electricity with recording. He fashioned it with radio, and he said it's just no good. And the thing is that what they eventually did, and it was with the assistants, Theodore working on it, Walter Miller and a few others, they bought equipment from the RCA company to make their electric recordings. It's kind of fascinating that some of the earliest of the Edison electrics were made using RCA equipment. Who would have thunk such a thing would happen? But Edison was completely out of the recording industry by the time electrical recording came. And then Theodore took over and had lofty plans, but there was no money. So it was a little bit late to do much of anything, although there was a whole series of new machines that were designed by Theodore, and eventually a lateral record, which basically had about 3 or 4 months of production time. And then while Thomas Edison was dedicating the Menlo Park laboratory at Greenfield Village in the Henry Ford Museum, it was at that time that Charles Edison killed the phonograph company. And there were no more inherent problems or other things like that. It all came to a grinding halt. And it seems at this point Thomas didn't care anymore. Kind of a sad end if you think about it. But nonetheless, Edison recordings, incredible pieces of the recording art. As for acoustic recordings, they really have no equal. Unfortunately, many things that should have been recorded weren't. And also, as Edison aged, his attitude toward certain types of music also took on bizarre proportions. I'm not saying that jazz was not well represented on the Edison record. It was. It did have a lot, especially after Thomas got out of the picture. He had a review board, which was basically a bunch of yes men, and that didn't solve much of anything. But when you listen to an Edison record, think of the incredible design. It's more incredible for the design more often than what's on the record. But Edison records are incredible. I'm a devotee of them. I love them. I love the quality of them. But I kind of wish that maybe one of the other companies got together and worked with Edison, and they could have had a wide range of recordings. It would have been incredible. But still, there's quite a few. So, just a little talk on this, just to ramble on about Edison records. And I hope to ramble on some more about it as time goes on.